list of martyrs, its history of martyrs, and other kinds of martyrdoms, which led to great insurrections. So maybe what happened in Hathras was to prevent such, not an insurrection, but such an imagination of an insurrection, which even a simple rite of passage could just trigger. So maybe that was what was at stake, which is at an anthropological level, at a general level. But then if the specific question of martyrdom is raised with regard to someone like Gandhi, now, of course, Gandhi, again, was someone who likened himself to Christ. And to that extent, almost a kind of, it was a kind of imitatio Christi, imitation of Christ's martyrological, life and self. But at the same time, Gandhi was someone who again, like he made his relationship with Gita totally personalized. His relationship to Christ was also personalized. So it has nothing to do with Christianity or religion or anything like that. It has something to do with he used again a very beautiful metaphor. It has something to do with the fragrance that I can feel from the life of Christ, not the so-called the great truth of the gospel, but the fragrance of the story, the fragrance of the life. And if you make things personalized and subjective, then of course martyrdom becomes more and more difficult to build, and something like friendship, even in death, you're a friend rather than a martyr to the people. So Gandhi, in a sense, was always playing, because he didn't die a martyr. Of course, at the very end, he was assassinated, so everything changed. But in his hunger strike, since your question was about the hunger strike, in none of his hunger strikes did he die. So what's interesting is that he reached a real point of kind of fuzziness about life and death, crisis. So in a sense, everything was also targeted to specific political ends. And I think a pure martyrological deployment would have been less successful than his very, 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 very successful and subjectively intelligent, though objectively often frustratingly sort of obtuse way of making martyrdom come close to friendship, and friendship look like an act of the martyr. So that is something very very interesting with regard to the singular life of, and the way Gandhi lived his life. Now, on the question of this, what is my overall question of through Simone Weil, the question intensity, on the question of radiation, of hunger strike, Gandhi's hunger strike, for instance. Now, let me cite a totally different text of this hunger as a systematic act of the body. There's a story by Franz Kafka called The Hunger Artist. If you read that story, you find that there is this artist who actually is an artist within a kind of a performance company, a kind of theater, not a theater, he's in a fairground, in a kind of mela, where he is a performer of his hunger, and he has not eaten for some 28 days or something. And he thinks he can go on. It's only that every time he reaches a point of almost dying, he is made to eat. And he is very disappointed, and he protests that he can go on for longer. And he's an artist because martyrdom is a result. Martyrdom is an end point. It is a kind of consolidation. But as a hunger artist, like any performer, he wants the performance to be true at every moment. Now, yes, the performance is for a spectator, but spectators could be saying that, look, he could actually be eating, behind his cage. He's in a cage, and he's hungry, and people come and watch him. He could go to a corner and be eating something. How do we know that he is actually not eating? Because it's a performance. Performance, by definition, is duplicitous. It's a kind of public lie, But he says, no, I'm really fasting, and I'm capable of fasting for more than 29, 30 days or however long he fasts. And so what he does is quite extraordinary. He sings all the time, you see. So even if you can't see him, you can hear him sing. You cannot eat and sing at the same time, no? You can't do two things with your mouth at the same time. So that is supposed to persuade the audience of the real or the truth of his act of hunger that he's hungry. But towards the end of the story, he loses his popularity, and people do not come to his cage anymore. He is now, earlier he was a star, now he is put into a corner, and he's someone who is still doing his hunger act, and he's staying hungry for long days. But people are now flocking to the cage next to his, and what is that? It's a panther. It's a panther with a radiating skin, and everyone is watching the jaws of the panther shine with its radiance, and everyone is transfixed by the shine of the movement of the mouth. And the panther is probably eating meat as a predator. Now people are not watching the one who is hungry. Now they're watching eating, not any eating, but the eating of a jaws which shine with the muscles which shine with a radiance that the hunger artist cannot replicate. Not because eating is more glamorous than staying hungry. On the contrary, hunger is more interesting than eating. Both Gandhi and Simone will agree on that. But as a panther, the jaws have a kind of muscular radiance of the truth of the panther's real, which the human real cannot bring to its muscles. This is the human failure of the performer. So, yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for the reply. আর এখনো অবধি কোনো প্রশ্ন আর আসছে না আপাতত। তো আর আপনার সময় অনুযায়ী আর কত মিনিট 5-7 বাকি আছে, দেখি।
আমার কোনো অসুবিধা নেই, আমি
হ্যাঁ, তো একটা প্রশ্ন এসে গেছে। It's by Vaibhav Abnave. He says that, let me frame my question. Can we say in our times the true challenge is to mobilize and to organize non-violence as partisan, divisive, and subjective thought force?
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I do agree with that. Only thing is the characterization of non-violence as the other of violence, the negative of violence, that itself begs the question. No, that if you're referring to violence, then violence is the one which governs non-violence also, the thought of non-violence. And this is exactly my point, that Gandhi, in a way, recognized this. Even if his metaphors are very lurid and almost, manipulated, but he recognized that it's only because there is already violence, not in the sense of physical violence, but in the sense of a kind of extreme manifestation of intensity, that something like non-violence can now be thought of either as an ethical action, or a kind of mix of practical and ethical action, or as a higher necessity in terms of some kind of spiritual or philosophical thought. But whatever it is only with regard to the historical immanent reality of, like I keep saying, of a continuum or a endless degrees of force, only a threshold of which is violent in the sense of physical violence. So non-violence then remains somewhere referred, or remains parasitic on the reality of violence. Now, what Vaibhav is asking is how to free oneself from this kind of dependent, subordinated relationship, and make the thought of violence, non-violence, almost, like I said, a kind of speculative, courageous, affirmative. How to affirm non-violence. Now, it seems to me that what Simone Weil is doing is it does help us in that search. She does not speak of non-violence as an absolute, or violence as an absolute. That's why she displaces the terms of our thinking, or our thinking. She speaks of something which is in the nature of radiance, not aesthetic radiance, not something which is the pleasure of the sheer mimesis of violence on the surface of the body. Why is cinema so popular, mainstream cinema, anywhere? Because it has so much play of the act of violence in terms of its sheer superficiality, that it excites us. If a drop of real blood were shed, it kind of poured through the screen, then probably the whole history of the aesthetic relationship to cinema would change. In the theater, that has happened, though. Real blood has been shed, and the aesthetics has changed. So even aesthetic ideology of violence seen as a pure act has gone through its own internal transformations. So in a way, what Simone Weil is doing is saying that these terms of discourse, or these terms of thought, or these terms of thought actually make us encounter such impossible impasses or impossible points through which we cannot pass, that let us not think in terms of spectacle and real, violence and non-violence, which are always based on the idea of something which is negative, but something which is, like you yourself said, force. So if we start with force, and indeed thought force is a kind of force which is singular, then the actual question of non-violence is only a secondary part of that, as much the question of violence is a secondary part of that. So yes, I agree with you. If we are willing to discuss a certain reorientation of this question of violence and non-violence in relation to what is primary, which is the courage of thought. So yes.
Okay, sir. And the next question is by Saket Kanetkar. He says that if we look at both the metaphors Gandhi used of breaking the head and spitting, both are in a way metaphors of an imaginary order. Can we say that where these metaphors were uttered at Indian audience in the United Kingdom, there was a possibility of symbolization of Ambedkar as other and expecting the other to be in its place.
Exactly. That is what I'm saying. That is what I find so difficult to understand. That why would Ambedkar Gandhi say this of someone who he himself says that he can't deny his uh, exceptional power of the intellect, who he himself, in a sense, holds up as later he will call him singular in terms of his intellectual exceptional, well, to use Webber's term, force of thought after Annihilation of Caste. Even though he repudiates the book, he says it is a singular book. It has a singular author. So even from the point of view of maintaining the caste hegemony of the upper castes while speaking in the language of so-called becoming untouchable, Gandhi could very well uh, tactically alienate Ambedkar from the rest of the depressed classes and say, look, generally depressed class, and he did say things which are um, which are shameful about the depressed classes, that they can't think. He used the analogy of they being like cows. They're cows who can be, herded and guided by anybody. He could have made Ambedkar someone exceptional and kind of co-opted him into the elite Brahmanical upper castes, Ambedkar the Brahmin or something like that. But you see, that won't help in the situation that he was put in vis-a-vis Ambedkar, because Ambedkar had done something real political breakthrough. So I've not spoken about that today at all, but that is, after all, at the heart of everything, no, at the foundation of everything, which is a massive political breakthrough of representation through separate electorates. This is a real moment, which is not an Ambedkar's personal power or triumph or intellectual virtuosity, an act of intellectual virtuosity. It is a collective moment. And so many people have pointed out that Indian history would have changed if that collective moment were allowed to lead its life, its historical life. Now, Gandhi clearly sees it, because after all, the violence of Gandhi's uh, rejection of separate electorates, even if it comes a little late in the day, showed that he somewhere sensed that this is something radical at the heart of that totality, which is Hindu totality or society or Hindu society. So there was no way he could exclude Ambedkar from it. So the only way to get back at Ambedkar then would be, like you correctly say, to insult Ambedkar in the way that the upper castes constitutively insult the who they consider untouchables. But of course, you cannot do that in a straightforward casteist way, simply. So that's why in Gandhi, now I'm not saying Gandhi does all this in any kind of systematic deployment of, the discursive tools, because no one can do it like that. But something far deeper is at work, which is what I'm calling the unconscious of Gandhism. Gandhism is a kind of unconscious of society. And at that level of the unconscious, he does both things at the same time. He insults Ambedkar and he says, but, because why does he insult him? He insults him by posing a degraded action from, as imagined from coming from his side. Because spitting is degraded insofar as it is an upper caste action meant to be done by the upper castes, and from the point of view of the oppressed, it is something which is degraded. So in a sense, make the oppressed equally degraded, and then finally grant them the very right to be degraded. So this is the kind of drastic pushing of the discourse to the limits, which happens visibly in front of you with these metaphors. And you're right. What it does achieve in its efficacy is really to maintain Ambedkar's position exactly as a member of a degraded class, while Gandhi is praising Ambedkar to the skies at the same time. So yes, absolutely, I agree.
আচ্ছা, ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার। আমাদের মনে হয় আর 1 মিনিট বাকি আছে 8টা বাজতে।
ঠিক আছে, দেখো যদি কারোর কিছু
হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ,
বলার থাকে নিশ্চয়ই, কোনো অসুবিধা নেই।
ওকে, so if anybody has any questions or comments, please post your questions in the comment box. আপনাদের যদি কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে বা কোনো মন্তব্য থেকে থাকে, আমাদের আর কিছু সময় আছে, অল্প সময় আপনারা
1 মিনিট তো 5 মিনিট হতে পারে আমার।
হ্যাঁ, তো আপনারা আপনাদের প্রশ্ন করুন এই কমেন্ট বক্সে। Please post your questions or other comments in the comment box. Okay, we're waiting for questions. আর কোনো প্রশ্ন? Any questions? Any comments? কার কোনো প্রশ্ন অথবা মন্তব্য করার থাকলে বা কোনো বিষয়ে কিছু বলার থাকলে আপনারা প্লিজ এই কমেন্ট সেকশন বক্সে প্রশ্নটা রাখুন স্যারের কাছে, বা কোনো মন্তব্য থাকলে। এখন আমরা অন্তত 5-7 মিনিট আমাদের সময় আছে, তো স্যার একটা দুটো প্রশ্ন নিশ্চয়ই নিতে পারেন। So we have 5 to 7 minutes left. So if you have any questions or queries, please post it in the comment section box. We are eagerly waiting for your questions. কোনো প্রশ্ন অনেকেই দেখছেন, কিন্তু
মানে লিখে করতে হবে, এটা কি জরুরি? কেউ যদি মুখে বলে জিজ্ঞেস করতে চান, সেটা কি সম্ভব এই ফর্মে? না, তোমাদের তোমরা এটা আয়োজন করছো তাদের লিখেই করতে। আমি জানি না তোমরা যেরকম।
আচ্ছা, লিখে করলে
নিশ্চয়ই নিশ্চয়ই, যেভাবে তুমি
লিস্ট
চাও।
করলে এবার যদি কেউ তারা বলতে চায়, আমি তাহলে তাদেরকে ইনভাইট করতে হবে। এই
হ্যাঁ,
ইনভিটেশন লিঙ্কটা
আমি জানি না,
ইনভিটেশন
আমি কিছু বুঝি না, তাই আমি জিজ্ঞেস করছি। যেরকম
So we're eagerly waiting for the questions to be asked. So if there are any questions, any queries, please to ask. আর কোনো
তোমার
প্রশ্ন?
তোমার যদি কিছু বলার থাকে তাহলে তুমি বলো নবনীল, বা তোমার যদি কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকে, তোমার ইচ্ছে, তোমার যদি কিছু বলার থাকে, তুমি তো নিজে এই পাঠ্যচক্রের আয়োজক।
না, আমি একজন অংশীদার বলতে পারেন, আমি ঠিক মানে মূল আয়োজক হয়তো সেটা বলা হয়তো
না না, মানে অনেকের মধ্যে তুমি একজন।
হ্যাঁ, অনেক। তো আমার মনে হয় আর খুব একটা প্রশ্ন আসছে না।
কোনো অসুবিধা নেই,
তো
অসুবিধা নেই। তো আমার তরফ থেকে আমি সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ জানাই যে আপনারা এলেন, শুনলেন, অনেক কথা হলো এবং আরো কথা হবে, আবার নিশ্চয়ই এরকম আলোচনার সুযোগ হবে। এবং নবনীলকে আমার তরফ থেকে বিশেষ করে ধন্যবাদ যে
আচ্ছা, বলতে না বলতেই আমাদের শেষ প্রশ্নটা এসে গেছে। It's by Advait Deshmukh. His question is, where does state violence lie in the spectrum of violence to non-violence, especially in your articulation of how non-violence expects violence from the other?
no, this is again a foundational question. I spoke about it a little bit. That state violence is first of all, it is a legitimate violence. State violence. I mean, Walter Benjamin has a very complex original essay about it, Critique of Gewalt. In German, Gewalt apparently is not violence, but merely but legitimate violence. So the whole question of legitimate violence uh, is something which leads you to not simply both inflict violence from the position of the state function as a functionary of the state, also to be subjected. It leads you to be subjected to violence from the side of the state as someone who formally actually agrees to be within that sphere of legitimate violence. So the entire logic of state violence is a logic of consensual terror. And this is what is the highest form of terror, which is a consensus on terror. So today, when we speak of terror as the radical other of a consensus, all of us agree that the other is a terrorist, and the other could very well be committing acts of extreme, unjust, horrifying acts. That is a totally different question. But the discursive consensus that the other is a terrorist, and then, of course, to give the other a certain figuration, a certain face, a certain name in history again and again, that can only take place in a very consolidated way, only because the state is the original consolidation of legitimacy. And there are two things here, not just that there is legitimate violence, but in a way, legitimacy beyond a point itself is violent. See, it is not just that the police can legitimately use violence to, or the state eventually, the death penalty is an eventual act of the extreme act of legitimate violence. But that is obvious. And though, of course, contested. But insofar as the state is a supreme organ of legitimacy, organization of legitimacy, even something purely non-violent is potentially a source or a carrier of violence. The most glaring example of this is the media today. If anyone thinks media is actually a private media, of course it's private media in the sense of corporate private, but something which is non-state, which it was supposed to be as a separation of the estates and all that. After the French Revolution, media is a fourth estate, a separate from the other three. If anyone believes that, then that person is definitely living in a fool's paradise. The media is statized. mean, this is something which Agamben once said when he had come to India. The media is constitutively meant to sing the praises of the state, like angels have only one function, to sing the praise of God. Similarly, the media is angelic in, in the sense that angels are the most violent beings. Not because they commit violence with their fists and their arms and their guns, but because they praise legitimacy to such an extent that the very thought of legitimacy, hyper legitimacy, becomes the act of greatest terror. That is the meaning of state terror. State terror is not simply the act of putting people on, ফাঁসি দেওয়া এবং আর যত কিছু আমরা মানে যেগুলো হয় পুলিশ এবং আর্মি আর এগুলো না. The main thing about state is that the state as such is beyond, even if its actions are a site of questioning, but as such it is an act of, it is a space of consensus, of pure agreement. So if then in historical reality, one part of the state at a corner somewhere dares to question that legitimacy, then of course all of the violence of the state, not just the violence which comes from the violent apparatuses, the coercive apparatuses, but also from the ideological apparatuses, particularly the media today, turns on that particular corner and treats it as the other. But on what grounds? On grounds that all of this is only preemptive because the other is already violent. We expect only violence from the other. The other here, for instance, is Kashmir. It's Kashmir. So the question is not what is the reality and history of Kashmir. The Kashmir as an object, mediatized object, is expected to be violent. And everyone else is non-violent. But there is nothing more violent than this non-violence. No one who is willing to speak the truth will disagree with that. So yes, that's my answer.
Okay, sir. Thank you for the answer. And আমার মনে হয় যে আমরা এরপরে একটা প্রশ্ন নিই আর I think this is the last question we're taking. It's by Odrija Bose. She says, does abiding by the idea of non-violence also talks about another kind of violence? Does violence only stand for direct physical manifestation of rage?
Yeah. So So towards the end, again, we come to a very, very difficult and critical question. So rage is a kind of emotion. Rage is a kind of, so again, language plays a role in all of this, no? So rage is not necessarily a physical action. It could lead to a physical action, but rage as such is an emotion. It's a kind of intensity which is experienced by a person, right? But of course, it has a certain threshold of manifestation, or to use the earlier word from Simone Weil, a kind of radiation or radiance, which is on the verge of causing the greatest amount of physical effect, including the effect of death. Like I said, the law of death can come from rage. So this physical idea of rage is probably empiric. It's a kind of empirical limit of how much we can, as psychological subjects, tolerate. So if you can talk, it doesn't matter if it's a justice or injustice. It can be something which is a personal thing or a minor, everyday thing. But if it causes something like rage in us and it pushes us to a certain behavioral limit, then yes, it can lead to something which is explosive. Now, some of the contexts in everyday life can be actually contexts of deep seriousness and almost subjective beatitude. So love, Alain Badiou in a recent set of lectures that he gave pointed this out about violence in relation to love in amorous contexts. In amorous contexts, it's possible that violence can be a result of many kinds. but the context itself is beatific, it's beautiful. It has its own constitutive emotion is not rage, but it can lead to emotions which are raging. So in a sense, when we say love rages, then both things are there. Love has something so intense, but love has a threshold which is a kind of whose language becomes almost violent. So it's a paradox, but it expresses the reality of our experience, which is one side of the question. Now, the other side of the question is non-violence. Uh, I mean, I already spoke of non-violence uh, is the most brutal form of violence towards otherness, towards heterogeneity, towards minority, towards someone who disagrees with you, ultimately someone who wants to separate from you. Insofar as it is, and after all, we started out with Ambedkar on the question of separation of electorates, and Gandhi completely rejects separation as an idea. So someone who wants to separate from you in a real historical context, uh, that uh, enforced consensus at the level of the entire society and state is indeed the most powerful organization of what? It's very difficult to distinguish non-violence and violence here, because on the one hand, if something is agreed upon by everyone, willingly or unwillingly, the situation is entirely non-violent. Yeah, because there is no violence, everyone agrees. But the very fact that everyone agrees is a violent reality. So that's why what happens is, in a historical period taken over time, when this, and it happens in dictatorships where officially this kind of consensus is enforced, that for a period of time there is a kind of eerie non-violence, if you want to call it, in the most silent, ghostly, you know, form, that carries on for maybe 1 year, 2 years, and then again it explodes into something raging. If you want to use a word from psychoanalysis or psychological sciences, you can even call it psychotic. But it's not the psychotic behavior of the psychosis of the so-called pathological psychotic or the pathological mad person. It is a psychosis inbuilt in a hyper legitimate society which wants to see everyone agree. So that is, I think, something which is the which that's why I also, to a question by Vaibhav a few minutes back, I said that there is a there is a certain impasse or even a trap when one keeps oscillating between violence and non-violence and wants to choose between this or that. It seems to be. So yes.
Okay, sir. Thank you for such fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the viewers. আপনাদের সকলকে অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ আমাদের সাথে থাকার জন্য। এটা শেষ হয়ে গেলে আমরা এই ভিডিওটা আমাদের পেজে পোস্ট করে দেব, এবং তারপর একটা ইউটিউব চ্যানেলে আগামীকাল এই ভিডিওটা আমরা আপলোড করে দেবো। অনেকে জিজ্ঞাসা করেছেন থাকতে পারছেন না বলে। সো থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার, থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ।
ধন্যবাদ যারা যারা এলেন এবং যারা ভবিষ্যতে এটা দেখবেন, সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ।
থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ স্যার, এবং আমি বিশেষভাবে কৃতজ্ঞ আপনার কাছে, এবং যেহেতু বাবা একটু অধ্যাপনার সাথে যুক্ত ছিলেন, তো তো বিশেষ করে দুটো বই, একটা বইয়ের কথা আমি বইটা সামনেই রেখেছি, আম্বেদকার অ্যান্ড আদার ইমর্টালস। এই বইটার কথা খুব বলতেন ছাত্রছাত্রী, সবসময় এই বইটির কথা বলতেন, আম্বেদকার আদার ইমর্টালস। একটা হচ্ছে ফেটস অফ ভায়োলেন্স। এই দুটো আমার ভীষণ প্রিয় বই ছিল, এবং সেই থেকেই আমাদের যখন মনে হচ্ছিল তখন আমি আপনার কথাটা ছাড়া কারোর কথা মাথায় আসেনি।
ধন্যবাদ। আমার কিছু বলার নেই। দুর্ভাগ্য যে তোমার বাবার সঙ্গে কোনোদিন মুখোমুখি কথা হতে পারলো না, কিন্তু উনি যে মানে আমার কাজ দেখেছেন, পছন্দ করেছেন, সেটা আমি শুনে খুবই খুশি হলাম, খুবই খুশি হলাম। এবং
থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার।
কথা হতে থাকবে, কথা হতে থাকবে। ঠিক
নিশ্চয়ই,
আছে?
নিশ্চয়ই কথা ঠিক আছে স্যার। থ্যাংক
আচ্ছা,
ইউ।
বেশ, বেশ, থ্যাংক
হ্যাঁ,
ইউ।
বাই, বাই।